Hello and welcome. We have with us today Dr. Azeem Ibrahim, research professor at the Strategic Studies Institute at the US Army War College. Welcome, Dr. Azeem. Welcome to Arabiya English, and thanks for the time. And Dr. Azeem is also a very successful Al Arabiya columnist. We keep publishing his columns every now and then. Dr. Azeem, taking this conversation, beginning with the number of roles that you play, as somebody who's been an ex-army person, a very well-known researcher, you've also been an entrepreneur and a philanthropist. But you've been very heavily involved in this crisis. You've been writing about it. You've almost been an activist on the subject, the Rohingya crisis. What is your sense of things? To begin with, what is how do you go back to the genesis of this conflict, and where do we stand today?
Sure. Well, the Rohingya have been described by the United Nations as the most persecuted minority in the world. You know, I came across the Rohingya about half a decade ago. I realised then that they were a highly persecuted minority. But when I tried to find out more about them, I realised there's nothing really out there. You know, I was genuinely quite surprised that there's no articles, there's not many, briefings on it, there's not even a single book on the topic. So I wrote a number of op-eds on the topic, and then I made a trip to the region, both to Myanmar and to Bangladesh. Then I visited Malaysia and Thailand to investigate the trafficking routes. And the culminated from that was the book that I put together, which as today is the only book on the Rohingya situation. The persecution of the Rohingya can be dated back to the Second World War, when the Japanese invaded what was at that time British Burma. The majority Buddhist population supported the Japanese invaders, believing that this would lead to swifter independence after the Japanese are victorious, whereas the minority Rohingya population stayed loyal to the British colonial masters. So after the war, when the British were victorious, there was bad blood between the two people. But despite that, there was relative calm, there was relative peace between the communities up until 1962, when there was a military coup by somebody called General Ne Win. And he tried to do what he called implement the Burmese road to socialism, which was a communist manifesto, which was a complete economic disaster. So he did what a lot of dictators do in that situation, is that they tried to find a scapegoat to blame all the ills of society on. And the Rohingya minority were the minority of choice, who were already seen with suspicion because they have a different skin colour, they have a different language, they have a different culture, a different religion. So they were the minority of choice to blame all of these ills of society on. And he passed a number of laws trying to make Burma a Buddhist country, that only Buddhists can be loyal citizens of this country, which culminated in the 1982 Citizenship Act, which stripped all the Rohingya of their nationality and their citizenship, making them the largest stateless people around the globe. So the persecution of the Rohingya can be traced back quite some distance.
Mm-hmm. You've come back from Bangladesh, and Bangladesh is a very important player in this now because it has a number of refugees from here. Bangladesh traditionally has had a problem with refugees. Now with these flowing numbers, how is that country coping? What can you give a sense from the ground?
Well, Bangladesh, as you know, is one of the poorest countries in the world. It's also one of the most densely populated countries in the world. They have a massive population, approximately 180 million people crammed into this very small area, and the land mass is actually decreasing every year because of rising sea levels. The Bangladeshis were already host to over 250,000 Rohingya refugees, and over the last month, another 615,000 have come over their border into Bangladesh. So it's extremely difficult situation. They're putting strain on Bangladesh. But they have, I came from the refugee camp just a few days ago. The Bangladeshis, I believe, have behaved in a stellar fashion, trying to cater for these refugees. But the difficulty is the long-term solution. Bangladesh is currently in negotiations with Myanmar to trying to figure out a way in which to repatriate some of the Rohingya back to Myanmar. And I believe that those discussions are futile. I do not believe that Myanmar is serious in those discussions. They've had similar discussions in 2012, 2013 and 2016. I believe that Myanmar is simply trying to buy time, as much time as possible, until the world's attention moves on to the next crisis and those refugees become a permanent feature within Bangladesh. And in that situation, Bangladesh will only have two choices: either keep those Rohingya permanently interned in these camps that they've created for them, or to absorb them into their own population. And that itself is going to pose significant significant difficulties.
Looking at the international community, what can the international community actually do to drag Myanmar towards the resolution of this conflict?
I think the international community has to put a lot more pressure on Myanmar to, first of all, cease all the hostilities against the Rohingya, the crimes against the civilians. And at the same time, I think a lot more pressure has to be put on them to repatriate the Rohingya back into Myanmar. The Rohingya that I met in the camps, just a few days ago, I asked almost every one of them that question: is that, are you willing to go back to Myanmar? All of them said yes, we are, but only if you're given full citizenship and equal rights. So there has to be a pathway to citizenship before anybody is repatriated. I don't believe Myanmar is serious about the talks of repatriating the Rohingya. So this is going to be a non-issue unless there is full citizenship and equal rights given to the Rohingya.
Has the United Nations done enough?
The United Nations has not even acknowledged significantly that the problem even exists. And some of the people I have been speaking to at the United Nations have indicated to me that they're simply waiting for this crisis to be over, just to let itself play out so that it moves from the criminal sphere of ethnic cleansing and genocide into the sphere of humanitarian concerns, so they can focus specifically just on the humanitarian issues to address those needs. And that is the position, I think, of the United Nations, which we can now see.
Last word on Rohingya. Do you see, or has the military solution been discussed at any point in time? Is it going to be counterproductive? What is your sense on that?
Well, nobody is advocating any sort of military action or military solution whatsoever. So I don't even think that's on the table. I think what needs to be done is that Myanmar really has to be brought to account for the atrocities and the crimes that they have committed against the Rohingya people. And that should include various options, such as sanctions, smart sanctions, targeting individuals, and also fines for Myanmar, penalties. Myanmar seems to have gotten away with this a number of times. They've done the same thing, almost every few years. They test the grounds to see how many Rohingya they can expel. It seems this time round that they have gained the confidence in terms of trying to ethnically cleanse the entire Rohingya population from Myanmar.
Moving to this part of the world, the Middle East, you've written extensively on some countries. There are lots of conflicts that we are dealing with at the moment, especially Syria and Libya. Some of the pieces that you've written recently have been read quite extensively. What is your take on the Russian intervention in the Middle East? Things that appear to be changing equations quite a bit, but it has abated for a while. Where does that intervention stand, and how do we go from here?
It seems that the Russian intervention in the Middle East is probably one of the most significant events that we've seen over the last few decades. We have to understand how the genesis of where this intervention came from. It really came after President Obama refused to reinforce his red line in terms of chemical weapon use, which can be dated back to 2012. In the summer of 2012, Russia seen an opportunity there, and it simply stepped into the vacuum that the United States has left. And I understand President Obama's motivation was that he did not want another US president being involved in another Middle Eastern war, and I think that's actually weak leadership. The United States is the world's global superpower, and if they are not willing to take the responsibilities of that being a superpower, seriously, then it's only natural that another power will step into that vacuum, and that's essentially what's happened with the Russians. And the difficulty now is that the Russians have essentially become a permanent feature in the Middle East, and the dynamic has changed quite considerably. And just to give you a quick example, if you were a Middle Eastern leader, if you were, for example, Hosni Mubarak or Ben Ali or somebody else of that nature who have been allies of the United States for decades, half a century almost, and when your regime was threatened, what was the position of the United States? The United States did absolutely nothing. Whereas if you're Bashar al-Assad, whose father was a client of the Soviet Union for almost half a century, what did they do when their client was threatened? They stepped in with boots on the ground, with warplanes, with military support. So if you're a Middle Eastern ruler and you're looking at which side, what superpower, which global power is more likely to support my regime and keep me in power, then the Russians have obviously stepped up to that mark.
You talked about changed equations. The equations also changed with the arrival of Trump. So now the Middle Eastern regimes are trying to gravitate towards him, looking for solutions. How do you look at the Trump presidency so far, and what do we expect in the years to come?
Well, I think nobody really understands what Trump policy in the Middle East actually is. It seems to be changing quite dramatically from time to time. It seems that Trump's position is just articulated from the person that he last spoke to. One thing I would say about Donald Trump is that he has recognised the threat that Iran poses to the region. One of the reasons why the United States went into the Middle East, went into Iraq, was to contain Iran. And the precise opposite has happened because of US mismanagement and their lack of strategic understanding of the region. You know, Iran has now become a serious dominant player in this region. They dominate a number of countries, not just Iraq and Lebanon, but you're looking at Yemen and Syria as well. So they have now expanded their sphere of influence quite considerably. And I think where Donald Trump is certainly correct is to highlight the dangers that poses to the entire region and the balance. So I think some of the rhetoric on Iran might be overblown and might be dangerous to a certain extent, but I think they also indicate that a viable solution is needed to the expansion of Iranian power throughout this region.
Now, what lies ahead for the region in particular, and I'll probably include the Iranian nuclear deal into it because there are question marks on that as well. But looking at that crystal ball, do you think some of these conflicts are heading towards a resolution in 2018?
Well, you know, as Logie Baird, the famous sports broadcaster, said, predictions are very difficult, especially when they're about the future. And I have no mechanism by which to try to make predictions. But I do think that I don't see many of these conflicts being resolved. If anything, I see a possible expansion, of some of these conflicts, particularly in Lebanon, which has now become a bit of a hotspot. Now, the difficulty in Lebanon is that Hezbollah, who has a considerable foothold and considerable influence and power in Lebanon, has now been transformed from what was essentially a militant insurgency organization into a very hard, a very hard-trained military force who has now got experience in capturing and holding territory, which is something they never had before, and they've gained that experience in Syria. So they are now considerably more emboldened, which actually makes the Israelis very nervous. So I think if there's going to be a flashpoint in the region, the next flashpoint would probably be Israel and Lebanon, and I think that's one probably the closest to watch.
Thank you so much, Dr. Azeem, for your time, and
Thank
hope you had a good time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much.